as Norm and I were talking about a couple of minutes ago, 2 weeks ago, I went to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee's policy conference in Washington, D.C. I was one of 18,000 people who gathered to learn about and advocate for Israel in our nation's capital. Leaders from both Israel and the U.S., from across the political spectrum in both countries, spoke to this giant stage, on this giant stage of 18,000 people, about the importance of the relationship between our two countries. On the last day of the conference, I went to Capitol Hill to meet with Don Young and Lisa Murkowski with the rest of the Alaska delegation. Now, although every meeting with Don Young comes with a good story, or at least a story, I want to tell you, I'll save that one for later. I want to tell you another story that I heard over and over again at the conference. That story goes something like this. The Jewish people have been oppressed throughout their entire history. 75 years ago, the Nazis tried to erase the Jewish people. They succeeded in murdering 6 million of us, a third of the world's Jews. In response to the Holocaust, in response to that horrific event, the Jews were finally given a state of their own, so that we would never again be put in a position where we could not defend ourselves against existential threats. But of course, that story continues, even today. That even today there are forces throughout the Middle East and all over the world who want to wipe Israel off of the map. Israel is still under threat, the story goes, and she needs America's help to defend herself. I heard that story over and over from Democrats, Republicans, Israelis. Actually, there are quite a few heads of state from all over the world, from South America to Europe. All of them said some version of this story. To my ears, the story rings a little, this is like a totally rabbi way to do this, but to my ears, the story rings partly true and partly not so true. In the news today, Israel's military might is often contrasted with that of the Palestinians. The Palestinians do pose threats to Israel. Just 2 weeks ago, during the AIPAC conference, a rocket from Gaza, which is controlled by the Palestinians by a terror group called Hamas, a rocket from Gaza struck a home all the way north of Tel Aviv, not even close to the border with Gaza, but all the way north of Tel Aviv, in which 7 people were injured, 2 of them infants. Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, left AIPAC early to go back home to deal with this crisis. Palestinians do pose a threat to Israelis. And it wasn't just those 7 people. This attack sent hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Israelis that live in the center of the country in the middle of the night into their bomb shelters. Imagine for a second living like that. Hearing a siren go off in the middle of the night and having less than a minute to run to your bomb shelter. But this kind of Palestinian resistance, though it threatens individual Israeli lives, it doesn't threaten the existential nature. It doesn't threaten the existence of the state of Israel. Hamas, other Palestinian terrorist organizations, some might call them Palestinian resistance organizations, they pose a threat to individual Israeli lives, but not to Israel itself. And even, that's not liberal Jewish student rabbi up here telling you that. Any Israeli general, and I've met with many, will tell you the same thing. But unfortunately, that's not the whole story. When Israel looks around at her neighbors, it has a lot more to worry about than just the Palestinians. Israel's northern neighbors are Lebanon and Syria. Just over 10 years ago, in 2006, Hezbollah, which is largely based in Lebanon, launched hundreds of rockets into Israel, beginning what is known in Israel as the Second Lebanon War. In that war, that lasted just over a month, 40 Israeli civilians were killed by rocket and mortar attacks, and 120 Israelis that were in the military were killed. Not only did Israel suffer these casualties and thousands of injuries, but the entire northern population of the country had to flee their homes. And it's actually kind of interesting, because this was in the technological age, there were people that lived in the southern part of the country posting on Facebook, posting on all these different internet sites, actually, hey, I have an extra bed, I have a sleeping bag, come sleep in my room. And hundreds of thousands of Israelis that lived in the north slept in random other Israelis' homes in the south. Interesting story. But that was the nature of that, far-reaching nature of that war. During that war in 2006, Hamas shot 120 rockets into Israel every day. That's one rocket every 12 minutes, 24 hours a day. One rocket every 12 minutes. Since that war, since 2006, Hezbollah has amassed 150,000 rockets. That means that in a war with Israel that lasts 100 days, that lasts 3 months, they could launch over 1,500 rockets every day. That is not a hypothetical. That war will happen. And when it does, you can imagine what the scale of the catastrophe will be. Last war, 120 rockets a day. This war, 1,500 rockets every day. Unfortunately, next door in Syria, we all know a little bit more about what's going on in Syria. Iran used the Syrian civil war as a pretext for setting up its own military bases on Syrian soil. Its own Revolutionary Guard troops, Iranian Revolutionary Guard troops, are preparing for a future war with Israel based just across Israel's border into Syria. And we all know that Iran has one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East. Just as recently as January, it reiterated, a general in the Iranian military reiterated Iran's vow to wipe Israel off the map. So the people at AIPAC, they're not unfounded in their concern. They're not. The Jewish people have been oppressed throughout our history, and powerful forces continue to threaten us today. And as I heard so many people talk about threats facing Israel at AIPAC, I couldn't help but think about our upcoming holiday of Passover. That holiday during which we retell the story of the first existential threat to the Jewish people. At our Passover Seders, we will tell the story of how the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites and tried to wipe them out, tried to wipe them off the map by killing all of their male children. Thankfully, as we know, if you've been to a Passover Seder or read the book of Exodus, that plan was foiled, and Moses led the Israelites to freedom, never again to be slaves. So when speaker after speaker at AIPAC talked about the need to protect Israel from threats, I heard them taking this lesson from Passover, to heart. Never again shall the Jews let ourselves be subject to enemies, to people who want to do us harm. That is the lesson of Passover. But at the same time, in those same moments, sitting in that same chair in a room of 18,000 people, I couldn't help but think that the message of Passover does not end there. it doesn't end with the message of self-protection. So many times in our Haggadah, in the story that we read on Passover, we tell ourselves, be kind to the stranger, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We tell ourselves every year on Passover, remember what it was like to be oppressed, to be threatened, because we were threatened, because we were powerless. Passover teaches us to work for a time when no people will be oppressed. It teaches us to shape our own society so that all people are equal and that all people are free. So when person after person at AIPAC talked about existential threats to Israel, I could not help but think of the one huge existential threat that they were missing. That threat is not a nuclear Iran. It's not a threat that can be shot down by Iron Dome. The other threat is that Israel, that the Jewish people, forget Passover's second message. The other threat is that we forget what it feels like to be a stranger in a strange land. That we forget that we as Jews have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to act as if we ourselves were slaves in Egypt. The Jewish state is threatened when it ignores a central tenet of Judaism: to care for and protect the most vulnerable people in our midst. Next week, the week before Passover, Israel has an election. And at the ballot box, Israelis will speak volumes about which threats they find most troubling. During this election, in this historic election, Israel has the chance to show that it's a state for all of its citizens, not just its Jewish ones, but for the 24% of Israeli civilians who are Arab. In this election, Israel has the chance to show that all Jews, religious, secular, Orthodox, Reform, and every Jew in between, has a place in the state of Israel and has a right to pray at the Western Wall. During this election, Israel has the chance to show that it welcomes asylum seekers. Asylum seekers who fled to Israel, specifically because they could not believe, they could not imagine that the nation of Anne Frank, that the nation of Moses, could turn people away who had nowhere else to go. Israel has a chance to show that it has taken to heart both of Passover's messages: that the Jewish people must remain safe, and that the essence of being a Jew is caring for the stranger in our midst. If Israel ignores that threat, the very Jewishness of the Jewish state is threatened. And as someone who cares deeply about reducing threats that Israel faces, I wish that this threat, in addition to the other ones, got more airtime at AIPAC. That's why I think that it's important for more and more progressives to attend AIPAC. More people who care not only about protecting Israel's body, but also who care about protecting Israel's soul. The more people like that, the more people like us who are in the room, the more the conversation will shift. But of course, AIPAC is not the only way that we can engage with Israel. We can visit this wonderful and beautiful and complicated place. And we can support organizations like the New Israel Fund, who's working for a new Israel, an Israel based on equality and civil society, of Jews and Arabs and Russians and Bedouins and people that don't have Ashkenazi last names, but people who are citizens of the state of Israel. Or we can support the reform movement's AIPAC, the Israeli Religious Action Center, who is like a mix of the ACLU and so many amazing civil rights and civil liberties organizations. And they fight for not only civil rights, but also rights of non-Orthodox Jews to practice Judaism the way that they want in Israel. And who just 2 weeks ago won a decision in the Israeli Supreme Court banning the far-right Jewish Power Party, who has for many years used rhetoric of hatred and basically anti-Arab racist rhetoric. The AIPAC won a decision banning that party's leader from being able to run in the Knesset elections. There are so many ways to support Israel. And for those of us who care about a strong and peaceful and peace-loving Israel, for all of us who want to protect her body, her goof, but also her neshama, her soul, may all of us work to support an Israel that embodies not just one, but both of Passover's lessons. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.